Grief has a way of making us see things differently. When you've just buried your father, even the smallest act of kindness can feel like the most important thing in the world. Young Duke Corwin of Aelbridge learned this at a rundown estate auction, where nobody wanted a mangy dog with a bag over its head. The nobles laughed when he paid £1 for the pitiful creature. His servants shook their heads in disappointment. Everyone thought grief had clouded the 23-year-old Duke's judgment. But as Corwin led his strange purchase away, Father Osric, a weathered war priest, approached with trembling hands and wide eyes. This wasn't just any abandoned dog. It was something that had been thought lost forever. The old priest recognized what others could not see. What he whispered to the young Duke would change everything Corwin thought he knew about his father's legacy. But what secret could make a battle-hardened priest's voice shake with recognition? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cobblestones of Aelbridge's main courtyard echoed with the uncertain footsteps of a young man carrying more than just a rescued animal. Duke Corwin of Aelbridge walked slowly toward the grand entrance of his ancestral home, the mangy dog padding quietly beside him on a makeshift rope leash. The creature's head remained covered by that crude burlap sack, but its gait suggested intelligence, perhaps even nobility, beneath the neglected exterior. Margaret Thornfield, the head housekeeper who had served the family for 37 years, stood waiting in the doorway, her weathered hands clasped together at her waist, and her expression carried the particular mixture of concern and barely concealed disapproval that only long-time servants could perfect. Behind her, other members of the household staff peered through windows and doorways, their whispered conversations floating across the evening air like autumn leaves. "Your Grace," Margaret said, her voice carrying the weight of unspoken questions as Corwin approached, her eyes fixed on the dog with undisguised bewilderment. "I trust the auction proved profitable." Corwin managed a weary smile. The past 3 months since his father's sudden death had aged him beyond his 23 years. Dark circles shadowed his green eyes, and his usually neat brown hair showed signs of distracted running of fingers through it, a nervous habit that had developed since assuming the dukedom, not in the way you might expect. "Margaret." He paused at the threshold, suddenly aware of how this moment would be remembered. The day the young Duke brought home a mystery wrapped in burlap, but perhaps profitable in ways we don't yet understand. The great hall of Aelbridge stretched before them, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows that seemed to hold decades of family history. Portraits of previous dukes lined the walls, their painted eyes following visitors with expressions that ranged from stern disapproval to quiet wisdom. At the far end of the hall, above the massive stone fireplace, hung the most imposing portrait of all, Duke Osric of Aelbridge, Corwin's father, captured in his military uniform with his ceremonial sword at his side. That sword now hung in Corwin's study, a constant reminder of expectations he wasn't sure he could meet. Every morning when he entered that room to review estate business, the polished blade seemed to reflect not just light, but judgment. His father had been a giant among men, literally standing 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders that could fill a doorway and a voice that could silence a room full of arguing nobles. Corwin, while respectable in height at 5 feet 10 inches, felt perpetually in his father's shadow. Thomas Blackwood, the stablemaster, emerged from a side corridor, carrying a bucket of grain for the evening feeding. A man of 45, with hands that spoke of decades working with horses, he had the practical wisdom that came from understanding animals better than most people understood each other. His eyes immediately fixed on the dog, and unlike the other servants, his expression showed curiosity rather than skepticism. "Shall I prepare a place in the stables, Your Grace?" Thomas asked, setting down his bucket and approaching slowly. The dog's ears perked up beneath the burlap covering, responding to the gentleness in the stablemaster's voice. "Actually," Corwin said, feeling the weight of what seemed like a significant decision, "I think our friend here might prefer to stay closer to the house tonight. Could you arrange something in the kitchen courtyard?" Somewhere warm and secure? Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly, but she nodded with the efficiency of someone who had learned to adapt to the unexpected whims of nobility. Of course, Your Grace, though might I suggest we examine the creature first, determine its condition and origins? The word origins carried more weight than seemed necessary, and Corwin noticed the meaningful glance Margaret exchanged with Thomas. These two had served his family longer than he had been alive. They had seen things, knew things, remembered things that the official histories might have overlooked. Sir Edmund Ashworth chose that moment to enter the great hall from the direction of the library, his arms full of estate ledgers and correspondence. At 58, Sir Edmund served as the family's primary advisor and had been instrumental in helping Corwin navigate the complex responsibilities that had fallen on his shoulders so suddenly. His greying beard was meticulously maintained, and his clothing spoke of someone who understood the importance of presenting a proper image to the world. "Corwin," Sir Edmund said, then caught himself with a slight bow. "Your Grace, I trust the Fairfax auction concluded satisfactorily?" His eyes took in the scene, the young Duke, the mysterious animal, the gathered servants, and his expression grew carefully neutral. "Sir Edmund," Corwin replied, recognizing the tone that usually preceded unsolicited advice. "I believe it concluded exactly as it needed to." "Ah." Sir Edmund set down his papers on a nearby table and approached with the measured steps of someone choosing his words carefully. "And this acquisition represents a wise investment in the estate's future." Before Corwin could answer, the dog beneath the burlap covering let out a low sound, not quite a whine, not quite a growl, but something that seemed almost like recognition. The animal had gone still, its hidden head turned toward Sir Edmund with an intensity that made everyone in the hall pause. "Interesting," Thomas murmured, his experienced eye noting the dog's posture. "He knows you, Sir Edmund." Sir Edmund's face paled slightly, though he attempted to cover the reaction with a dismissive wave. "Nonsense. I've never seen this creature before in my life," but the dog's behavior suggested otherwise. Even through the burlap covering, it was clear the animal was focused entirely on the family advisor, its body tense with what could have been either anticipation or wariness. Margaret stepped forward with the decisive air of someone who had managed household crises for decades. "Perhaps we should tend to the poor creature's immediate needs before we attempt to solve any mysteries. Your Grace, with your permission, I'll have the kitchen staff prepare something suitable for." She paused, realizing she didn't know what type of animal they were dealing with. "For our guest," Corwin finished. "And Margaret, could you ask Father Osric to join us this evening? I believe he mentioned wanting to discuss something with me after the auction." This request caused another exchange of glances between Margaret and Thomas, though Corwin didn't catch the significance. Father Osric was known throughout the region as a man who carried himself with the bearing of someone who had seen both the glory and horror of war. His presence at evening prayers was always welcome, but his requested private audiences were rare and typically significant. As the servants dispersed to handle their respective tasks, Corwin found himself alone in the great hall with his mysterious purchase. He knelt beside the animal and spoke in the gentle tone his father had once used with wounded soldiers. "Well then, my friend, let's see what all this fuss is about." With careful hands, he began to untie the rope that secured the burlap sack around the dog's head. The knots were complex, more complex than necessary for simply containing an animal. Someone had taken great care to ensure this covering would not come loose accidentally. As the burlap fell away, Corwin found himself looking into the most intelligent eyes he had ever seen in an animal. The dog was clearly a large breed, with the noble bearing of a hunting hound, but its coat was matted and unkempt. Around its neck, barely visible beneath the tangled fur, was what appeared to be a collar of unusual design. The dog gazed up at Corwin with an expression that seemed almost human in its depth of understanding. This was not a common animal. This was a creature with a story, with a purpose, with secrets that someone had gone to great lengths to conceal. Outside, The sun was setting behind the rolling hills that surrounded Aelbridge, painting the great hall in shades of amber and gold. The portraits on the walls seemed to lean forward in the shifting light, as if the previous generations of dukes were eager to witness what would unfold next. Corwin settled into a chair near the fireplace, and the dog immediately positioned itself at his feet, not as a pet seeking comfort, but as a guardian taking up a protective position. Whatever this creature's past, it understood duty and loyalty in ways that spoke of careful training and noble purpose. As Margaret returned with a bowl of water and scraps of meat from the kitchen, she found the young Duke staring thoughtfully into the fire, one hand resting gently on the dog's head. For the first time since his father's death, Corwin seemed to have found something that gave him peace. "Your Grace," Margaret said softly, "Father Osric has arrived. He's waiting in the library and says the matter is urgent." Corwin nodded, understanding that whatever conversation awaited him would likely change everything. Some instinct told him that this dog, this strange purchase, made on impulse at a forgotten auction, was about to become the key to understanding not just his own future, but the carefully guarded secrets of his family's past. He rose from his chair, and the dog immediately stood as well, ready to follow wherever duty might lead. Together, they walked toward the library, toward Father Osric, toward the beginning of a truth that had been 20 years in the waiting. Father Osric stood with his back to the library door when Corwin entered, his weathered hands clasped behind him as he studied the extensive collection of military histories that lined the upper shelves. The priest's presence always carried the weight of someone who had witnessed the true cost of human ambition. And tonight that weight seemed heavier than usual. "Father," Corwin said, closing the door behind him. The dog immediately took position near the entrance, as if standing guard. "You asked to see me about something urgent." The old priest turned slowly, his grey eyes immediately fixing on the animal at Corwin's feet. For a long moment he simply stared, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, recognition, and something that looked remarkably like fear. "Sweet Mother of God," Father Osric whispered, sinking into the nearest chair. "After all these years." Valor, the dog's entire body went rigid at the sound of its name. Its ears perked forward, and it took several steps toward the priest, tail beginning to wag with an excitement that spoke of deep recognition and long separation. "You know this dog?" Corwin asked, though the answer was already obvious from both their reactions. "Know him?" Father Osric leaned forward, extending his hand for the dog to sniff. "My boy, I helped train him. Valor was the finest royal guard hound ever bred, intelligent, loyal, and trained to carry sensitive military communications across enemy territory. But that was 20 years ago, during the Thornwick campaign." Corwin felt the ground shift beneath his understanding of the world. "Thornwick? My father's great victory?" But the dogs of that unit were all killed in the battle. It was reported that the entire Royal Guard Hound Division was lost when they heroically defended the mountain passes. Father Osric's expression grew grim. "That's what the official report said, yes. But the truth, as it often is, was considerably more complicated." He stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the darkening estate grounds. "Your father was a great man, Corwin, but greatness doesn't always mean what we think it means." "What are you saying?" The priest was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with a decision he had been avoiding for 20 years. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of confession. The Royal Guardhound Division wasn't killed defending mountain passes. They were abandoned, left behind when the main force withdrew earlier than planned. He turned to face Corwin directly. The dogs and their handlers were sacrificed to maintain the appearance of a strategic victory. The words hit Corwin like physical blows. His father, Duke Osric, was celebrated throughout the kingdom as a brilliant military strategist who had turned certain defeat into glorious victory at Thornwick. Poets sang of his courage, historians praised his tactical genius, and young officers studied his campaigns as examples of inspirational leadership. "That's impossible," Corwin said, though even as he spoke the words, pieces began falling into place. The way his father had grown quiet whenever Thornwick was mentioned in his later years. The drinking that had increased after certain anniversaries. The way he would sometimes stare at his ceremonial sword as if it carried more weight than mere steel. Father Osric knelt beside Valor, running his hands through the dog's matted coat until he found what he was looking for, a collar hidden beneath the tangled fur. This collar bears the insignia of the Royal Guard's elite hound unit. Every dog was equipped with a special compartment designed to carry the most sensitive military communications. With practiced fingers that remembered skills from decades past, the priest manipulated a hidden mechanism in the collar. A small section opened, revealing a compartment that contained a rolled piece of parchment. Yellow with age and carefully preserved. Communications that were never meant to see the light of day, Father Osric murmured, unrolling the fragile document. The writing was in military cipher, but certain words were readable even without decoding. Abandoned units, necessary sacrifices, and most damning of all, tell the families they died as heroes. Corwin sank into his father's chair behind the great oak desk, the same chair from which Duke Aldrich had managed estate business and entertained visiting dignitaries. Now it felt like a throne built on lies. How many? He asked quietly. 47 handlers and their hounds. Good men who believed they were serving under a commander who would never leave them behind. Father Osric's voice grew thick with emotion. I was there, Corwin. I gave the last rites to boys who died thinking their sacrifice meant something noble. And this dog, Valor, he survived? Somehow. Though I suspect he wishes he hadn't. The priest's hand continued stroking Valor's head, and the dog leaned into the touch with the desperate affection of a creature that had been alone for too long. He must have been carrying this message when the unit was overrun. Probably spent years trying to complete his mission, to get this evidence to someone who could set the record straight. The implications were staggering. Not only had his father built his reputation on the graves of abandoned soldiers, but he had allowed their families to believe their loved ones had died in glorious battle. Mothers had treasured commendations for sons who had actually died, feeling betrayed and forgotten. Why are you telling me this now? Corwin asked, though part of him already knew the answer, because others know about this dog, about what he represents. Father Osric moved to the window again, his eyes scanning the grounds with the watchfulness of an old soldier. Word travels in certain circles. There are people who helped orchestrate the Thornwick cover-up, people who benefited from the version of events that made your father a hero. They can't afford to have that story questioned now. As if summoned by the priest's words, a shadow moved across the courtyard outside the library window. Then another. Men who moved with the careful precision of those accustomed to dangerous work. How long have they been watching? Corwin asked, his voice steady despite the fear creeping up his spine. Since the auction, I suspect. Buying Valor so publicly was both brave and foolish, my boy. You've announced to everyone who understands the significance that House Aelbridge is in possession of evidence that could topple several carefully constructed reputations. Valor rose from his position by the priest and moved to the window. A low growl building in his throat. His intelligence was evident in the way he assessed the threat, not the simple reaction of a guard dog, but the calculated response of an animal trained for warfare. What do they want? Corwin asked. The collar. The message, and probably to ensure that Valor never has the chance to lead anyone else to additional evidence. Father Osric's expression was grim. Your father wasn't the only one involved in the cover-up. There were other officers, political figures, people who built their entire careers on the heroic version of Thornwick. The weight of decision pressed down on Corwin's shoulders. He could return the collar, claim ignorance, and allow the lies to continue protecting his family's reputation. Or he could honor the memory of 47 abandoned soldiers and face the consequences of truth. Valor looked up at him with those intelligent eyes, and Corwin saw reflected there the same choice that had faced his father 20 years ago. The difference was that his father had chosen expediency over honor. Reputation over truth, comfort over justice. Father, Corwin said quietly, if we pursue this, if we try to expose what really happened at Thornwick, what are we risking? Everything, the priest replied without hesitation. Your family's reputation, your standing in society, quite possibly your safety. The men watching this estate tonight aren't here to negotiate, and if we don't pursue it, then 47 good men remain dishonored, their families continue believing a lie, and you spend the rest of your life knowing that your family's name is built on their unmarked graves. Outside, the shadows were moving closer to the house. Time for contemplation was running out, and Corwin understood that whatever decision he made in the next few minutes would define not just his own character, but the kind of leader he would become. He looked down at Valor, who had spent 20 years carrying the burden of truth, and made his choice. The private study that had once been Duke Aldrich's sanctuary felt different in the pale morning light that filtered through heavy curtains. Corwin had spent the sleepless hours before dawn searching through his father's personal papers, driven by Father Osric's revelation and the knowledge that dangerous men were watching his every move. The mahogany desk drawers yielded correspondence that painted a picture far different from the heroic narrative. Corwin had grown up believing letters from military officials bore dates from the weeks following Thornwick, their tone growing increasingly sharp as questions about the missing Royal Guard unit persisted. Your Grace, the families are asking difficult questions about their sons, read one missive from a Colonel Harrison. The story about heroic sacrifice in the mountain passes isn't holding. Some are demanding to see burial sites. His father's response was preserved in a carbon copy. Tell them the sites were overrun by enemy forces after the battle. The bodies were lost, but their sacrifice saved the entire campaign. Make sure they understand their sons died as heroes. Corwin's hands trembled as he read his father's careful orchestration of deception. Each letter revealed another layer of the conspiracy. Bribes to silence awkward questions. Threats to discredit those who asked too many. Transfers for officers whose consciences might prove troublesome. The most damning evidence emerged from a hidden compartment behind a false back in the largest drawer. Inside lay a blood-stained map of the Thornwick region marked with his father's own hand. Red ink showed the original positions of the Royal Guard unit, while black ink traced the retreat route that had abandoned them to enemy forces. Margin notes in his father's precise handwriting revealed the cold calculation behind the decision. RG unit expendable if it maintains strategic deception. Another note, written in different ink and clearly added later, showed a flicker of conscience. God forgive me. They trusted me, Your Grace. Corwin looked up to find Sir Edmund standing in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral as he took in the scattered papers and open drawers. The family advisor's eyes lingered on the blood-stained map for a moment too long, confirming what Corwin had begun to suspect. You knew, Corwin said quietly. Sir Edmund entered the study and closed the door behind him, his movements deliberate and controlled. I was your father's aide-de-camp during the Thornwick campaign. Of course I knew. And you said nothing? All these years, you helped perpetuate the lie. The older man settled into a chair across from the desk, his fingers steepled as he chose his words carefully. I helped protect this family's reputation and, by extension, the stability of the region. Do you have any idea what would happen if the truth about Thornwick became public knowledge? The political upheaval, the military reforms that would be demanded, the noble families whose fortunes are built on that victory. 47 men died, Edmund. Corwin's voice carried a steel that reminded Sir Edmund uncomfortably of Duke Aldrich in his younger days. 47 good men who trusted their commander not to abandon them. 47 men who were already dead, Sir Edmund replied, with the cold pragmatism that had made him valuable to the previous duke. The enemy had surrounded their position. Your father could have led the main force into a trap trying to rescue them, losing hundreds more lives. Or he could make the strategic decision to preserve the greater good by leaving them to die and then lying about it. by making the choice that saved 1,000 other soldiers and secured a victory that brought peace to the region for 2 decades. Sir Edmund leaned forward, his voice taking on the persuasive tone he had perfected in years of political maneuvering. Your father was a great man who made an impossible decision under terrible circumstances. Don't let one tragic necessity destroy everything he built. Valor, who had been lying quietly by the fireplace, raised his head and fixed his intelligent eyes on Sir Edmund. The dog's posture changed subtly, muscles tensing as if recognizing an old enemy. The dog remembers you, Corwin observed. Sir Edmund's composure cracked slightly. Animals have long memories for people they associate with unpleasant experiences. What unpleasant experiences would those be, Edmund? The family advisor was quiet for a long moment, clearly debating how much truth to reveal. Finally, he sighed with the weariness of a man who had carried heavy secrets for too long. I was the one who gave the order to withdraw without the Royal Guard unit. Your father was indisposed at a crucial moment, and someone had to make the decision. I chose to preserve the main force, rather than risk everything on what was already a lost position. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Corwin stared at the man who had been like an uncle to him, who had helped raise him after his mother's death, who had guided him through the complexities of assuming the dukedom. You ordered them abandoned. I ordered a strategic withdrawal that saved hundreds of lives and secured a victory that your father spent the rest of his career being celebrated for. Sir Edmund's voice hardened with defensive pride. And yes, I helped craft the narrative that made heroes out of necessary losses. Because sometimes the truth serves no one, and lies serve the greater good. A sound from outside the study window made both men freeze. Margaret's voice could be heard in the courtyard, speaking with someone in hushed, urgent tones. Valor immediately moved to the window, his hackles raised. They're still watching, Corwin said. Of course they are. Sir Edmund rose from his chair and moved to peer through a gap in the curtains. Word has spread through certain circles that the Aelbridge hound has returned. There are people with significant interests in ensuring that particular dog never has the opportunity to lead investigators to additional evidence. Additional evidence? Sir Edmund's expression grew even grimmer. Did you really think one dog carrying one message was the extent of it? The Royal Guard hounds were bred for intelligence and loyalty. They were trained to remember locations, to find their way back to specific places, even years later. Valor doesn't just carry evidence of what happened at Thornwick. He knows where the real graves are. He knows where your father ordered the actual burial of the men who were officially reported as lost. The implications crashed over Corwin like a cold wave. Not only had his father abandoned 47 men, but he had then hidden their remains to prevent their families from learning the truth. The heroic narrative required that the bodies be lost to enemy action, making proper burial and mourning impossible. Where? Corwin asked. I won't tell you that. Sir Edmund's voice carried the finality of a door closing. Because if you pursue this path, if you try to expose what happened, you'll destroy everything your father built and put yourself in danger from people who have spent 20 years ensuring this secret stays buried. But as Sir Edmund spoke, Valor moved to the study door and whined softly, clearly wanting to leave. The dog's behavior suggested intelligence beyond that of a normal animal, the kind of purposeful intention that came from training and deep, patient loyalty to a mission that had taken 20 years to begin. The old cemetery lay beyond the formal gardens of Aelbridge, where weathered headstones marked generations of family retainers and estate workers. Thomas Blackwood had reluctantly agreed to meet Corwin there as the sun reached its zenith, casting sharp shadows among the ancient markers. The stablemaster's weathered hands shook slightly as he led the young duke toward a section of ground that looked subtly different from the rest. I never wanted to be part of it. Your Grace, Thomas said quietly, his eyes fixed on a cluster of unmarked mounds that could easily be mistaken for natural variations in the landscape. But His Grace, your father, he said it was a matter of national security, said these men had died, serving their country and deserved to be laid to rest on land that honored their sacrifice. Valor moved among the unmarked graves with the purposeful intensity of a creature, following scent memories that had haunted him for 20 years. The dog paused at each mound, his behavior suggesting recognition and grief that transcended animal understanding. "How many?" Corwin asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. 47, Thomas confirmed. They arrived at night, carried in wagons with canvas covers. Some were already... He swallowed hard, the memory clearly still difficult. Some had been dead for weeks. But others, Your Grace, others had wounds that looked recent, like they'd been fighting for their lives right up until the end. The implications of Thomas's words settled over Corwin like a burial shroud. Not only had his father abandoned the Royal Guard unit, but some of the men had survived the initial enemy attack only to die slowly, probably hoping for rescue that never came. Did any of them survive long enough to say anything? Thomas's expression grew pained. One did. A young fellow couldn't have been more than 20. He kept asking for Father Osric, kept saying he had something important to tell him. But by the time we found the priest, he shook his head. The boy died holding this. From his pocket, Thomas withdrew a piece of parchment that had been folded so many times it was nearly falling apart along the creases. The writing was in the same military cipher Corwin had seen in Valor's collar, but this message was longer, more detailed. "I never learned to read the soldier's code," Thomas said, "but that boy, he made me promise to keep it safe, said someday someone would come asking the right questions, and I'd know when to share it." Corwin carefully unfolded the fragile document, recognizing immediately that this was a field report written by someone with military training. The cipher was complex, but certain words were clear enough. Betrayed, abandoned, tell our families the truth. "Thomas, when you buried these men, did anyone else know? Anyone outside the immediate family?" The stable master nodded reluctantly. "Margaret helped prepare the bodies for burial. She insisted on treating them with proper dignity, even though," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "even though Sir Edmund said it would be better to handle the matter more quickly." The mention of Sir Edmund's involvement sent a chill down Corwin's spine. The family advisor's role in the conspiracy was evidently more extensive than even his confession had revealed. "Where is Margaret now?" "In the kitchen gardens, Your Grace, but she's been nervous since yesterday. Keeps looking out the windows, jumping at shadows. I think she knows something's changed." As they walked back toward the main house, Valor suddenly stopped and growled low in his throat. His attention was fixed on a cluster of trees that bordered the cemetery, where the shadows seemed deeper and more purposeful than natural shade would warrant. "We're being watched," Corwin murmured. Thomas's hand moved instinctively to the pruning knife on his belt. Not much of a weapon, but the gesture of a man who understood they might be in danger. "Aye, Your Grace. Been feeling eyes on us since we came out here." A figure detached itself from the tree line, an older man in dark clothing who moved with the careful deliberation of someone accustomed to not being noticed. As he approached, Corwin could see that his face bore the weathered look of someone who had spent years in harsh conditions, and his eyes held the particular wariness that came from living with dangerous secrets. "Your Grace," the man said, inclining his head in a gesture that fell somewhere between respect and caution. "My name is Marcus Webb. I served under your father during the Thornwick campaign." Corwin felt Thomas tense beside him, but Valor's reaction was different. The dog approached Marcus with recognition, tail wagging slightly as if greeting an old friend. "You were part of the Royal Guard unit." Marcus shook his head. "I was a scout attached to the main force, but I saw what happened to the Hound Division, and I've spent 20 years living with that knowledge." He looked down at Valor with something approaching reverence. "Never thought I'd see this old fellow again." "What do you want, Marcus?" Corwin asked, though he suspected the answer would complicate his situation even further. "To help you do what your father never had the courage to do. Tell the truth about what happened to those men." Marcus's voice carried the weight of decades of suppressed guilt. "But also to warn you. The people who helped orchestrate the Thornwick cover-up aren't all dead yet, and they have resources your father never dreamed of. They know you have. Valor, they know you're asking questions, and they're not going to allow 20 years of careful narrative management to be destroyed by one idealistic young duke. As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses reached them from the direction of the main road. Multiple riders, moving at a pace that suggested urgent business rather than casual travel. "Your Grace," Thomas said urgently, "we need to get back to the house. Now." But Marcus caught Corwin's arm as he turned to leave. "Before you go, there's something else you need to know. The coded message in Valor's collar? That's not the only evidence. Each of the hounds carried different pieces of information, and not all of them died at Thornwick." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying Valor isn't the only survivor. There are others, other hounds, other pieces of evidence, other witnesses who have been living in shadows for 20 years, waiting for someone with the courage to bring the truth to light." The sound of hoofbeats was getting closer, and Corwin could see dust rising from the main road. Whatever was coming, it was coming fast, and with purpose. "How do I find these others?" he asked quickly. Marcus smiled grimly. "You don't find them, Your Grace. They find you. But first, you have to prove you're worthy of their trust by surviving what's about to happen next." With that cryptic warning, Marcus melted back into the shadows among the trees, leaving Corwin and Thomas alone with their growing understanding of just how deep the conspiracy went and how dangerous the truth was going to be. The riders who approached Aelbridge that afternoon wore the colours of the Royal Investigation Commission, but their bearing suggested military rather than administrative background. Corwin watched from the library window as they dismounted in the main courtyard, their movements precise and coordinated in a way that spoke of shared training and dangerous experience. Margaret appeared at Corwin's elbow, her usual composed demeanour replaced by barely controlled anxiety. "Your Grace, the men are asking to speak with you about matters of estate security. They say they've received reports of suspicious activity in the region." "What kind of suspicious activity?" They weren't specific, but she paused, wringing her hands in a gesture Corwin had never seen from the typically unflappable housekeeper. "Your Grace, I think it's time I told you about the visitors we used to receive in the months after Thornwick." Corwin turned from the window, his attention fully focused on Margaret. "What visitors?" "Men who came at night, always when your father was away on business. They would meet with Sir Edmund in the library, speaking in low voices about things that needed to remain quiet. Sometimes they brought wagons with canvas covers, and sometimes they took wagons away." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "And sometimes, Your Grace, those wagons carried things that were the size and shape of men." The implication hit Corwin like a physical blow. Not only had the bodies of the abandoned Royal Guard unit been secretly buried on his family's land, but there had been an ongoing operation to relocate evidence and possibly eliminate witnesses. "Margaret, how long did these visits continue?" "For about 3 years after Thornwick. Then they stopped, around the time your father began drinking more heavily and spending long hours staring at that ceremonial sword." She glanced toward the weapon hanging prominently on the wall. "I always wondered if the weight of whatever he'd done was finally catching up with him." A commotion in the courtyard drew their attention back to the window. The lead investigator, a stern-faced man with greying temples, was examining the ground near the stable entrance where Valor's paw prints were clearly visible in the soft earth. Even from a distance, Corwin could see the man's expression change from casual interest to sharp focus. "They know about the dog," Corwin murmured. "Your Grace," Margaret said urgently, "there's something else. After each of those nighttime visits, I found things in the kitchen, personal effects that looked like they belonged to soldiers. A locket, a ring, letters from home. Sir Edmund told me to dispose of them, but I couldn't bring myself to throw away what might be someone's only connection to their lost son or husband." "You kept them?" Margaret nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Hidden in the pantry behind the old flour barrels. Dozens of items that belonged to men whose families probably still wonder what happened to their loved ones' personal belongings." Before Corwin could respond, a firm knock echoed from the main entrance. The investigators had finished their outdoor examination and were ready to begin their official inquiry. "Your Grace," Margaret whispered, "what do you want me to tell them about the dog?" Corwin looked down at Valor, who had positioned himself strategically by the library door, not hiding, but alert and ready to act as circumstances demanded. The dog's intelligent eyes seemed to hold a question. After 20 years of carrying this burden, was his master finally ready to face the truth? "Tell them nothing until I've spoken with them," Corwin decided. "But Margaret, tonight, after they've gone, I want you to show me everything you've kept. Every locket, every letter, every piece of evidence that those men existed and mattered to someone." The housekeeper nodded with relief, as if she'd been waiting 20 years for permission to honor the dead properly. Sir Edmund appeared in the library doorway, his face pale but his manner composed. "Your Grace, the investigators are requesting an immediate audience. They say they have information about threats to estate security that require urgent discussion." "What kind of threats?" "They weren't specific, but they did ask specifically about any unusual acquisitions you might have made recently." Sir Edmund's eyes flicked toward Valor with barely concealed anxiety. "They seem particularly interested in livestock or animals that might have come from questionable sources." The coded language was clear enough. The investigators knew about the auction, knew about Valor, and probably knew far more about the Thornwick conspiracy than they were initially letting on. "Very well," Corwin said, straightening his shoulders in unconscious imitation of his father's bearing when facing difficult situations. "But the conversation takes place in the Great Hall, with witnesses present. I won't be questioned privately about matters concerning my family's honor." As they made their way toward the Great Hall, Valor fell into step beside Corwin with the precision of a military escort. The dog's presence was both comforting and terrifying, a living link to truths that powerful people had spent decades trying to bury. The lead investigator introduced himself as Captain Morris of the Royal Investigation Commission, though his bearing and the way his men positioned themselves around the room suggested military intelligence rather than civilian administration. His eyes immediately fixed on Valor with recognition that confirmed Corwin's worst fears. "Your Grace," Captain Morris began, his voice carrying the particular authority that came from years of handling sensitive matters. "We understand you recently acquired an animal at the Fairfax estate auction. A dog of unusual breeding that may be connected to matters of national security." "I purchased a neglected animal out of compassion," Corwin replied carefully. "I wasn't aware that acts of mercy had become matters of national security." Captain Morris's smile held no warmth. "Compassion is admirable, Your Grace, but when that compassion extends to animals that may carry information dangerous to the stability of the realm, it becomes our concern. What kind of information could a dog possibly carry? The kind that could destabilize carefully maintained historical narratives, damage the reputations of respected military figures, and potentially threaten the peace that has existed in this region for 20 years. The captain's eyes never left Valor as he spoke. "We're prepared to offer substantial compensation for the animal's transfer to appropriate authorities who can ensure its proper care." The euphemistic language couldn't hide the threat. They wanted Valor dead, along with whatever evidence he represented, and they were offering Corwin the opportunity to cooperate voluntarily before they resorted to less pleasant methods of persuasion. "I'm afraid the dog has already become quite attached to his new home," Corwin said, his voice steady despite the danger he could feel radiating from the men positioned around the room. "I couldn't possibly part with him now." Captain Morris nodded, as if he had expected this response. "I understand your attachment, Your Grace, but I should mention that we've received reports of dangerous individuals in the area, men with connections to old military campaigns who might seek to use historical artifacts for purposes that could embarrass the Crown or threaten public order." "What kind of artifacts?" "Documents, personal effects, communications that were never meant to become public." the kind of materials that unscrupulous individuals might use to create false narratives about past military operations. The captain's tone remained conversational, but his meaning was clear. We're here to protect you from such individuals and to ensure that any historical materials in your possession are properly preserved through official channels. Valor rose from his position by Corwin's feet and moved to stand directly between the young Duke and Captain Morris. The dog's posture was calm but alert, ready to defend or attack as the situation demanded. His actions spoke of training that went far beyond normal canine behavior. This was a military animal responding to perceived threats with tactical awareness. Interesting, Captain Morris observed, his hand moving almost imperceptibly toward his weapons. The dog seems to have retained some of his specialized training despite years of apparent neglect. The admission confirmed what Corwin had suspected. These men knew exactly who Valor was and what he represented. The question now was whether they would try to complete their mission through continued negotiation, or whether the situation would escalate to more direct methods. The tension in the Great Hall stretched taut as Captain Morris and his men waited for Corwin's response. The young Duke could feel the weight of decision pressing down on him. Cooperate and betray the memory of 47 abandoned soldiers, or resist and face consequences that could extend far beyond his own safety. Father Osric chose that moment to enter the hall, his weathered hands carrying a leather satchel that looked far older than his years of service. The priest's presence immediately changed the dynamic in the room, and Corwin noticed several of Captain Morris's men shift uncomfortably at the sight of him. "Your Grace," Father Osric said quietly, "I apologize for the interruption, but I believe these gentlemen and I have met before." Captain Morris's composed facade cracked slightly. "Father, I wasn't aware you were still serving in this region." "I serve where my conscience leads me, Captain. Just as I did 20 years ago when I gave last rites to men who died far from home, wondering why their commander never came back for them." The words hung in the air, like an accusation that none of the investigators could ignore. Captain Morris's hand moved more deliberately toward his weapon, and his men began positioning themselves with the subtle coordination of a unit preparing for action. "Father, I think you may have some confusion about past events. The historical records of the Thornwick campaign are quite clear about the heroic sacrifice of the Royal Guard unit. Historical records can be written by the victors to say whatever serves their purposes." Father Osric replied, opening his leather satchel and withdrawing a collection of personal items that made several of the investigators go pale. But these belonged to real men with real families, and their stories deserve to be told truthfully. Corwin recognized some of the items from Margaret's hidden collection: a wedding ring, a locket containing a child's portrait, letters written in the careful script of men who might not live to see their loved ones again. But Father Osric had additional items that spoke of a much more extensive preservation effort. These were recovered from the actual battle site at Thornwick, the priest continued, his voice carrying the weight of decades of suppressed testimony. Not the heroic mountain pass defense described in the official reports, but the abandoned position where 47 men died waiting for rescue that was never intended to come. Captain Morris signaled to his men with a subtle gesture, and they began moving to block the exits from the Great Hall. "Father, I'm afraid you're interfering with matters of Crown security. These historical artifacts need to be examined by proper authorities to determine their authenticity and significance. I've spent 20 years authenticating them through prayer and penance," Father Osric replied steadily. "Each item represents a life that mattered, a family that deserved truth instead of comfortable lies." Valor moved to position himself between the priest and the nearest investigator, his military training evident in the way he assessed multiple threats simultaneously. The dog's behavior confirmed what Corwin was beginning to understand. This wasn't an investigation. It was a cleanup operation designed to eliminate the last witnesses to the Thornwick conspiracy. "Captain," Corwin said, his voice carrying new authority as the pieces of the puzzle finally assembled in his mind. "I think it's time you explained exactly what authority you're operating under. Because if you're here on Crown business, you should have proper documentation. And if you're here on someone else's business, then you're trespassing on my land and threatening my guests." The captain's mask of official authority slipped further. "Your Grace, I strongly advise you not to interfere with matters that affect national security. There are forces at work here that extend far beyond your understanding." "Then help me understand," Corwin challenged. "Explain to me how the truth about what happened to 47 soldiers 20 years ago threatens national security today." "Because," Captain Morris said, abandoning all pretense of diplomatic language, "there are people whose entire careers, whose fortunes, whose political positions are built on the heroic version of Thornwick. Revealing the truth wouldn't just embarrass a few military officers, it would destabilize the power structure of half the kingdom's noble houses." The admission confirmed Corwin's growing suspicion that the Thornwick conspiracy extended far beyond his father's personal shame. This was about protecting an entire network of people who had benefited from the false narrative of heroic sacrifice. "And you're here to make sure that destabilization doesn't happen." "I'm here to offer you the opportunity to be part of the solution rather than the problem," Captain Morris replied. "Your father understood the greater good sometimes requires difficult choices. You could honor his memory by making the same choice he did." Father Osric stepped forward, his voice ringing with the moral authority of someone who had spent decades wrestling with complicity and guilt. His father's choice condemned 47 good men to unmarked graves and their families to lives of unanswered questions. Honor doesn't come from perpetuating that injustice. It comes from having the courage to set it right. Margaret appeared in the doorway leading from the kitchen corridors, her arms full of additional personal items that she had been retrieving from their hiding places. Behind her, Thomas carried a wooden box that clearly contained more evidence of the conspiracy's scope. "Your Grace," Margaret said, her voice shaking but determined, "I thought you should see all of it. Every piece, every letter, every token of the men who died, trusting in your father's honor." The sight of so much preserved evidence seemed to galvanize Captain Morris into action. He made a sharp gesture to his men, and they began moving toward the assembled group with clear, hostile intent. But valor was ready. The dog's growl deepened to a sound that spoke of 20 years of suppressed rage, finally finding an outlet. His posture shifted from protective to aggressive, and even the experienced investigators hesitated at the sight of a military animal preparing to defend his charges. "Captain," Corwin said quietly, "I think you should know that this estate has been home to soldiers for generations. My servants may not wear uniforms, but they understand loyalty, and they understand when their home is threatened." As if summoned by his words, other members of the household staff began appearing in doorways and corridors around the great hall. Kitchen workers carrying knives, stable hands holding tools that could serve as weapons, groundskeepers who had served the family through multiple generations and had no intention of seeing their young Duke intimidated by men with dubious authority. The investigators found themselves outnumbered and surrounded by people who might lack military training but possessed the determination that came from defending their home and their chosen leader. "Your Grace," Captain Morris said through gritted teeth, "this is far from over. There are people with much more resources than I have, and they won't be deterred by household staff and a sentimental attachment to historical artifacts. Then they can come and explain themselves properly," Corwin replied. "But they'll find that Aelbridge honors its debts, including the debt we owe to men who died, trusting in our family's word." As the investigators reluctantly withdrew from the estate, Corwin understood that he had crossed a line from which there would be no retreat. The truth about Thornwick was no longer a family secret. It was a declaration of war against 20 years of carefully constructed lies. 3 days after the investigators' departure, Valor exhibited behavior that puzzled everyone at Aelbridge. The dog would stand at the base of the estate's abandoned tower, whining softly and pawing at stones that had long ago fallen from the ancient structure. His persistence was so unusual that Corwin finally decided to investigate what had captured the animal's attention. The tower dated back to the estate's earliest days, when Aelbridge had been a defensive position rather than a peaceful manor house. Most of its upper levels had been sealed off for decades due to structural concerns, but the ground level had been used for storage, until even that had been abandoned to the mice and spiders. Father Osric accompanied Corwin as they forced open the heavy wooden door that led into the tower's base. The air inside was thick with dust and the musty scent of years of neglect. But Valor moved through the gloom with the purposeful intensity of an animal following a familiar trail. "He's been here before," Father Osric observed, watching the dog navigate around fallen stones and decayed furniture with confidence that spoke of memory rather than exploration. Valor led them to what appeared to be a solid stone wall at the tower's far end, but his behavior suggested there was more than met the eye. He scratched at a particular section of stone, whining with increasing urgency until Father Osric knelt to examine what had caught the dog's attention. "There's a mechanism here," the priest said, running his fingers along what looked like natural variations in the stonework. "Someone built a hidden entrance. With careful manipulation of the concealed triggers, a section of the wall swung inward to reveal a narrow staircase that descended into darkness beneath the tower's foundation. The air that flowed from the hidden passage carried scents that made Valor tremble with excitement and grief, familiar smells that had drawn him back to this place after 20 years of searching. "Should we fetch torches?" Corwin asked, but Father Osric was already producing a small lantern from his robes. "I came prepared," the priest said grimly. "I suspected this day might come." The staircase led to a natural cave system that had been modified with careful stonework to create a series of connected chambers. The first chamber contained supplies that spoke of long-term habitation, food stores, blankets, medical supplies, and weapons that had been maintained with military precision. But it was the second chamber that stopped them in their tracks. A man sat in a chair carved from the living rock, his back to the entrance and his attention focused on a collection of documents spread across a makeshift table. Even from behind, his posture spoke of military training and the particular alertness that never fully faded in soldiers who had survived impossible situations. "Jonathan?" Father Osric called softly. The man turned slowly, revealing a face marked by 2 decades of hiding and the particular gauntness that comes from living with constant pain. But his eyes burned with the fierce intelligence of someone who had been waiting a very long time for this moment. "Father Osric," Jonathan Milwright said, his voice hoarse from disuse, but still carrying the precise diction of an educated soldier. "And you must be young Duke Corwin. I've been waiting to meet you." Valor bounded across the chamber and threw himself against Jonathan's legs with joy that transcended normal animal affection. The man's hands shook as he stroked the dog's head, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Good boy, Valor. Good boy. You found them, didn't you? After all these years, you brought them home." "Jonathan," Father Osric said, his voice thick with emotion, "we thought you were dead. Your wife, Sarah, she's been searching for answers about what happened to you for 20 years. "I know." Jonathan's reply carried more pain than anger. "I've watched her from a distance, seen her grow old, waiting for news that I could never safely provide. But if I had revealed myself, if I had tried to return to her, the people who orchestrated Thornwick would have killed us both to protect their secret." "What happened?" Corwin asked. "Father Osric told me the Royal Guard unit was abandoned, but he said all the men died in the battle." Jonathan's expression hardened with memories that had clearly never lost their sharp edges. "Most did, but 5 of us survived the initial attack and managed to reach a defensive position in the rocks. We held out for 3 days, waiting for the rescue that your father had promised would come." He gestured to the documents on his table, and Corwin could see they were military maps marked with detailed notations about troop movements and defensive positions. When it became clear that no rescue was coming, that we had been deliberately abandoned, 4 of us tried to fight our way back to friendly lines. I was the only one who made it, and only because valor led me to these caves when I was too wounded to travel further. But the official reports said— "The official reports," Jonathan interrupted, "were written by men who needed the world to believe that 47 soldiers had died heroically defending mountain passes rather than being left to die in a trap that could have been avoided." His voice grew bitter. "Your father needed a glorious victory to advance his career, and dead heroes serve that purpose better than live witnesses to betrayal." Father Osric moved closer to examine the documents Jonathan had been working with.
"What is all this?"
20 years of investigation, Father. Every detail I could gather about the conspiracy that cost my brothers their lives and their families. The truth about what happened to them." Jonathan's hands moved across the papers with practiced efficiency. Names, dates, correspondence between the conspirators, financial records showing payments made to ensure silence. Corwin felt the blood drain from his face as the scope of what Jonathan had uncovered became clear. How many people were involved? More than you can imagine. The Thornwick cover-up required cooperation from military officers, political figures, noble families, and crown administrators. Your father wasn't the architect of the conspiracy. He was just one player in a much larger game. Jonathan stood with obvious difficulty, his movements suggesting old injuries that had never properly healed. He walked to a collection of wooden crates stacked against the cave wall and opened one to reveal carefully preserved personal items, uniforms, weapons, letters, and most significantly, the collars of other Royal Guard hounds. Valor wasn't the only survivor. Your Grace, 3 other hounds made it out of Thornwick alive, and they've been living in secret all these years, carrying evidence that could destroy the reputations of half the kingdom's leadership. The implications were staggering. Not only had Corwin inherited a family legacy built on betrayal, but he had stumbled into a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the kingdom's power structure. "Why are you telling me this now?" Corwin asked. "Why reveal yourself after 20 years of hiding?" Jonathan's smile held no warmth. "Because the men who ordered the Thornwick betrayal are getting old, Your Grace. They're dying off one by one, and their heirs are scrambling to ensure that the truth dies with them. The investigators who visited your estate 3 days ago weren't there to protect Crown security. They were there to eliminate the last evidence that could expose their families. Participation in mass murder. What do you want from me?" "Justice," Jonathan replied simply. "Not revenge, not personal satisfaction, but justice for 47 men who died believing their commander would never abandon them. And truth for 47 families who deserve to know how their sons and husbands really died." Valor moved to stand between Corwin and Jonathan, as if offering himself as a bridge between the past's pain and the future's possibilities. The dog's presence seemed to ask a question that transcended words. After 20 years of carrying this burden alone, would the new Duke of Aelbridge have the courage to finish what his father should have started? "The evidence you've gathered," Corwin said slowly, "is it enough to expose the full scope of the conspiracy?" Jonathan nodded grimly. "More than enough. But presenting it will require someone with the standing and resources to ensure it reaches the right people, and the courage to face the consequences of destroying so many carefully constructed lies." As Corwin looked around the hidden chamber at 20 years' worth of patient investigation and careful preservation of evidence, he understood that his decision at the estate auction had been far more significant than purchasing a single dog. He had inherited a war that had been fought in shadows for 2 decades, and now he had to choose whether to surrender or carry the battle into the light. The discovery of Jonathan Milwright and his evidence changed everything at Aelbridge. Within hours of returning from the hidden chamber, Corwin found himself managing what amounted to a war council in his father's former study. The room had never felt smaller as it accommodated Jonathan's carefully organized documentation of the Thornwick conspiracy. spread across every available surface like a map of betrayal. The key, Jonathan explained, his voice stronger now that he was finally able to share the burden he had carried alone for 20 years. His understanding that Thornwick was never meant to be a victory. It was meant to be a controlled defeat that could be spun into a strategic triumph after the fact, Father. Osric studied a collection of coded military dispatches that Jonathan had intercepted during his years of investigation. These suggest the enemy commanders knew exactly when and where to position their forces for maximum impact against the Royal Guard unit, because they were told, Jonathan confirmed grimly. Your father didn't just abandon his men, Your Grace. He sold them. Information about their positions, their numbers, their planned movements, all passed to enemy commanders in exchange for guarantees that the main force would be allowed to withdraw with minimal casualties. Corwin felt physically ill as the full scope of his father's betrayal became clear. He made a deal with the enemy? A carefully negotiated arrangement that served everyone's interests except those of the men who died for it, Jonathan replied. The enemy got a spectacular victory to show their own people. Your father got to claim he had saved the main force through brilliant tactical withdrawal, and the political figures who had invested in his career got a war hero to promote. Thomas entered the study carrying a tray of food and hot tea, his weathered face showing the strain of the past few days. Your Grace, there are more men watching the estate. Different ones this time. They're not trying to hide their presence. Through the study windows, Corwin could see figures positioned at various points around the estate grounds. Unlike the investigators who had tried to maintain a pretense of official authority, these watchers made no effort to conceal their hostile intent. They're escalating, Margaret observed, peering through a gap in the curtains. Whoever sent Captain Morris isn't pleased that diplomacy failed. Jonathan moved to examine his evidence with the urgency of someone who understood their time was running short. We need to get this documentation to people who can act on it before they decide to solve the problem more directly. Who can we trust? Corwin asked. If the conspiracy reaches as high as you say it does, how do we know any official authority will act rather than participate in another cover-up? There are still honorable men in positions of power, Father Osric replied, though his voice carried uncertainty. But identifying them requires care, and reaching them requires surviving the immediate threat. As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses echoed from the main road. But these weren't the controlled formations of official investigators. This was the thunder of multiple riders moving at combat speed. Sir Edmund burst into the study without knocking, his usual composure completely shattered. Your Grace, you need to escape. Now. There are at least 20 armed men approaching. And they're not here to negotiate. Edmund, Corwin said carefully. How do you know they're not here to negotiate? The family advisor's face crumpled with the weight of guilt that had clearly been crushing him for years. Because I sent word to certain parties that you had discovered Jonathan and his evidence. I hoped, they would offer you a more generous deal to ensure your cooperation. The admission hit the room like a physical blow. Jonathan's hand moved instinctively toward a weapon that wasn't there, while Father Osric stepped protectively closer to the evidence they had been organizing. You betrayed us, Corwin said, his voice carrying a deadly quiet that reminded everyone present of his father's most dangerous moments. I tried to protect you, Sir Edmund protested. These people have resources beyond your imagination. They can destroy your family's reputation, your estate's finances, your personal safety. I thought if I showed them you were reasonable, willing to negotiate. You thought wrong, Jonathan interrupted. His soldiers' training evident in the way he began assessing defensive positions and escape routes. These people don't negotiate with witnesses. They eliminate them. Margaret had been listening at the door, and she turned back to the group with fear plain on her face. They're surrounding the house. Front and back entrances, all the ground floor windows. We're trapped. Thomas joined her at the door, his stablemaster's knowledge of the estate's layout evident in his quick thinking. There are other ways out, Your Grace. The old servant passages, the root cellars, the tunnel that connects to the wine caves. Tunnel? Jonathan asked with sharp interest. Built during the estate's defensive period, Thomas explained. Runs from the main house to the old watchtower, then connects to natural cave systems. Your father had it sealed years ago, but the seals could be broken. Vala, who had been unusually quiet during the discussion, suddenly moved to the study's main window and began growling with an intensity that spoke of imminent danger. Outside, the mounted figures were dismounting and beginning to position themselves for an assault. "They're not waiting for darkness," Father Osric observed. "This is meant to look like a robbery gone wrong, or bandits attacking an isolated estate." Jonathan moved with sudden decisiveness to gather his most crucial evidence. "Your Grace, we have perhaps 10 minutes before they breach the main entrances. Whatever we do, this documentation cannot fall into their hands. It represents the only proof that 47 men died for something other than glory." Corwin found himself thinking with a clarity that surprised him. The young man who had bought a dog on impulse just days before was gone, replaced by someone who understood that leadership sometimes meant making choices that would define not just his own life, but the lives of everyone who depended on him. "Thomas, show us this tunnel." Margaret, gather the most portable evidence and prepare to move. "Father Osric," he paused, meeting the priest's eyes with newfound determination. "Can you get word to Sarah Millwright? If we don't survive this, someone needs to tell her what happened to her husband." "If we don't survive this," Father Osric replied grimly, "Sarah and every other family member of the lost soldiers will never learn the truth about what happened to their loved ones." The sound of splintering wood echoed from the direction of the main entrance, followed by voices calling for the surrender of all occupants. The final confrontation was beginning, and Corwin understood that the next few hours would determine not just whether he lived or died, but whether 20 years of injustice would finally be exposed or buried forever. Jonathan shouldered a pack containing his most crucial evidence and looked directly at Corwin with the respect of one soldier recognizing another. "Your Grace, I want you to know that whatever happens next, you've already proven yourself worthy of the men who died at Thornwick. They would be proud to serve under a commander who chose truth over comfort." Vala positioned himself at Corwin's feet with the absolute loyalty of a creature that had found its true master after years of searching. The dog's presence seemed to say that after 2 decades of carrying the burden of abandoned loyalty, he had finally found someone worthy of the trust that had been so brutally betrayed. As they prepared to flee through passages that had been designed to protect the estate's inhabitants from enemies, Corwin reflected on the irony that they were now using those same defenses against people who claimed to represent legitimate authority. The line between justice and treason had become blurred beyond recognition, and he was about to discover which side of that line history would place him on. The sound of boots on the main staircase meant their time for preparation was over. Whatever happened next would determine whether the truth about Thornwick would finally emerge from the shadows where it had hidden for 20 years, or whether it would die with the last witnesses who had the courage to speak it. The hidden passage behind the study's bookshelf had not been opened in 15 years, and the mechanism protested with grinding stone and accumulated dust as Thomas forced it into motion. The sound seemed impossibly loud against the backdrop of armed men searching the rooms above, but necessity drove them forward into darkness that smelled of centuries and secrets. Corwin carried his father's ceremonial sword, not for its symbolic value, but because its weight felt reassuring in his hand as they navigated the narrow tunnel by the light of Father Osric's lantern. Behind him, Jonathan moved with the careful precision of someone whose old injuries made every step deliberate, while Vala ranged ahead and behind their small group with the alert efficiency of a military scout. "The tunnel forks ahead," Thomas whispered, his knowledge of the estate's hidden infrastructure proving invaluable. "Left leads to the wine cellars beneath the kitchen, right leads to the watchtower foundation. From there we can reach the cave system where Jonathan was hiding, and from the caves," Corwin asked, Multiple exits, Jonathan replied grimly, but also multiple ways for them to trap us if they know the layout, as well as they seem to know everything else about this place. The sound of splintering wood echoed from somewhere above them, followed by angry voices and the crash of overturned furniture. Their pursuers had discovered the empty study and were clearly frustrated by their quarry's disappearance. "They'll find the passage entrance soon enough," Father Osric observed. These passages were built for concealment, not prolonged defense. As if responding to his words, a new sound reached them from behind, the grinding of stone that meant someone had discovered the bookshelf mechanism. Light began to flicker in the tunnel behind them, confirming their worst fears about pursuit. "Move faster," Corwin ordered, abandoning stealth for speed as their situation became desperate. They reached the fork in the tunnel just as shouts echoed from the passage behind them, confirming that their pursuers were closing the distance. Thomas led them right toward the watchtower, reasoning that the more complex route would provide better defensive positions if they were forced to make a stand. The watchtower foundation opened into a circular chamber carved from bedrock, with 3 separate passages leading deeper into the estate's underground network. But as they emerged from the tunnel, Valor's sudden growl warned them that they were not alone. Captain Morris stepped from the shadows of one passage, flanked by 2 armed men whose bearing suggested military experience and current hostile intent. "Your Grace," he said with mock courtesy, "I really wish you had accepted our generous offer for a peaceful resolution." "There's nothing peaceful about covering up mass murder," Corwin replied, raising his father's sword with hands that were steadier than he had expected. "Mass murder?" Captain Morris smiled coldly. 47 soldiers died in service to their country during a legitimate military operation. The only question is whether their sacrifice will continue to serve the greater good, or whether misguided idealism will turn their deaths into a scandal that serves no one. Jonathan stepped forward, his own weapon drawn despite the obvious pain movement caused him. Their deaths serve no one because they were betrayed by the man they trusted to lead them home. They were sacrificed for strategic necessity. Captain Morris replied with the cold calculation of someone who had rationalized terrible decisions for decades. Duke Aldrich understood that sometimes leaders must make choices that history will judge harshly, but circumstances demand absolutely. "History should judge them harshly," Father Osric said, his voice carrying the moral authority of someone who had given last rites to the victims of those choices. "Because there was nothing necessary about abandoning loyal soldiers to protect one man's reputation." The captain's composure finally cracked, revealing the desperation beneath his official manner. "You have no idea what you're interfering with. The stability of the entire region depends on maintaining certain narratives about past events. Expose Thornwick, and you'll destroy the careers of dozens of people whose families have served this kingdom faithfully for generations." "Then they should have served it honorably," Corwin replied, his father's sword steady in his grip despite the trembling he felt inside. The sound of approaching footsteps from multiple passages made it clear that Captain Morris had positioned his men to prevent any escape. The circular chamber was becoming a trap, with armed figures emerging from tunnels that should have provided refuge. But Valor had spent 20 years learning these underground passages, and his behavior suggested he knew something their enemies did not. The dog moved to a section of the chamber wall that looked identical to the rest, but his pawing at the stone revealed another hidden mechanism. "There's another way," Thomas realized, following Valor's lead and finding the concealed triggers that opened yet another passage. "The old smuggler's route connects to caves that exit near the river." "Go," Jonathan commanded, turning to face the approaching soldiers with the calm determination of someone who had accepted the likelihood of dying for his cause. "Get the evidence to people who can act on it." "I'm not leaving you to fight alone," Corwin replied. But Jonathan's expression brooked no argument. "You're not just Corwin anymore. You're the Duke of Aelbridge, and these men died trusting in that title's honor. Don't let their sacrifice be meaningless by dying in a tunnel when you could live to see justice done. Captain Morris raised his weapon, abandoning all pretense of negotiation. Enough talking. Surrender the evidence, and you'll be allowed to live quietly with your guilt. Refuse, and you'll join the men whose memory you're so eager to champion. The moment stretched taut between words and violence, between truth and comfortable lies, between the easy path of cooperation and the dangerous road of resistance. In that instant, Corwin understood why his father had chosen as he did, not from malice or cowardice, but from the terrible weight of decisions that offered no clean solutions. But unlike his father, Corwin had seen the cost of choosing reputation over honor, and he had looked into the eyes of families who had spent 20 years wondering why their sons' bodies were never found. The easy path led only to more graves and more lies. Fire, he called to the others, and chaos erupted in the ancient chamber as violence finally claimed the space that words could no longer fill. The underground chamber erupted in violence that 20 years of careful conspiracy had made inevitable. Corwin's father's ceremonial sword, which had hung as a symbol of honor earned through betrayal, now rang against weapons wielded by men determined to preserve that betrayal at any cost. Father Osric proved that his years as a military chaplain had included more than just spiritual duties, moving with surprising agility to shield the precious evidence while engaging Captain Morris's men with a competence that spoke of battlefield experience. His lanterns, swinging wildly as he fought, cast dancing shadows that turned the ancient chamber into a scene from nightmares. Jonathan fought with the desperate efficiency of a man who had survived impossible odds before and had no intention of failing in his final battle. Despite his injuries and 20 years of hiding, his military training remained sharp, and his knowledge of the underground passages gave him tactical advantages that his enemies had not anticipated. But it was valor who proved most formidable in the close quarters of the stone chamber. The dog moved with deadly precision, using his size and training to disrupt enemy formations while protecting his human companions with loyalty that had been forged in the crucible of abandonment and tested through decades of patient waiting. Thomas, despite having no military experience, fought with the fierce determination of a man defending his home and the people he had served faithfully for decades. His knowledge of the estate's layout proved crucial as he guided the group toward escape routes while fending off attackers with tools that had been designed for peaceful work but served adequately for desperate combat. The sound of steel against steel echoed through stone passages that had witnessed centuries of conflict, but never with stakes quite so personal or consequences quite so far-reaching. Each clash of weapons represented the collision between truth and lies, between justice delayed and injustice perpetuated. Captain Morris, his official composure completely abandoned in the face of resistance he had not expected, fought with the viciousness of someone whose entire world depended on eliminating witnesses to old crimes. His sword work spoke of professional training and extensive experience in situations where survival required killing people who knew inconvenient truths. "You're destroying everything," he snarled at Corwin during a brief lull in the fighting. 20 years of peace, stability built on necessary choices, families who have prospered because they understood the greater good. "Peace built on unmarked graves isn't peace," Corwin replied, parrying a vicious thrust and responding with an attack that drove the captain back toward the chamber's center. "It's just delayed justice. The turning point came when valor, following instincts that transcended normal canine behavior, led a flanking maneuver through passages that Captain Morris's men had not discovered. The dog's intimate knowledge of the underground network, combined with his military training, allowed him to appear behind the enemy positions at precisely the moment when their attention was focused forward. The surprise was complete and decisive. Soldiers who had been confident in their tactical superiority found themselves caught between defending against frontal assault and protecting their rear from an attack they had not anticipated. In the confusion that followed, Father Osric was able to secure the evidence, while Thomas cleared a path toward the escape route Valor had identified. But victory came at a cost that would haunt everyone involved. Jonathan, his old injuries exacerbated by the violence and his body pushed beyond its limits by necessity, collapsed near the chamber's entrance, with a finality that no amount of courage could overcome. "The evidence," he whispered to Corwin as life faded from his eyes. "Promise me the evidence reaches people who will act on it." "Don't let them die for nothing." "I promise," Corwin replied, understanding that he was accepting a burden that would define the rest of his life. Father Osric knelt beside Jonathan's body and spoke words of blessing that carried the weight of 20 years of guilt, finally finding absolution. "He kept faith with his brothers," the priest said simply. "Now we must keep faith with him." Captain Morris, wounded but not defeated, made one final attempt to prevent their escape. "You'll never be safe," he called after them, as they disappeared into the passage Valor had opened. "There are too many people with too much to lose. This won't end here." "No," Corwin replied from the darkness beyond. "It won't end here. It will end in the light, where truth belongs." The escape through the river caves required hours of careful navigation, with Valor leading them through passages that had remained secret for generations. When they finally emerged into daylight near the estate's eastern boundary, they found the main house burning in the distance, a final gesture of spite from men who had decided that if they could not eliminate the evidence, they could at least destroy the place where it had been discovered. But the evidence survived, carefully preserved in Jonathan's pack and Father Osric's careful documentation. More importantly, the witnesses survived, battered, exhausted, but alive and determined to honor the promise made to a dying soldier in an ancient chamber beneath the earth. As they stood watching smoke rise from Aelbridge, Corwin understood that his old life was ending in those flames. What emerged from the ashes would be defined not by his father's choices, but by his own courage to choose truth over comfort, justice over reputation, honor over ease. Valor sat beside him, the dog's mission finally complete after 20 years of faithful service. But as they watched the destruction of the only home either of them had ever known, both understood that their real work was just beginning. 2 years after the flames consumed Aelbridge, Duke Corwin stood in the courtyard of his rebuilt estate, watching as Sarah Millwright placed fresh flowers on the memorial stone that now occupied the place of honor, where his father's portrait had once hung. The granite monument bore 47 names that had been officially forgotten for 20 years, but were now carved in stone that would endure for centuries. The investigation that followed Jonathan's death and the destruction of the original estate had shaken the kingdom to its foundations. Father Osric's testimony, combined with the evidence Jonathan had painstakingly gathered during his years in hiding, had exposed a conspiracy that reached far higher than anyone had dared imagine. Noble families had fallen, military careers had ended in disgrace, and political alliances had crumbled under the weight of revealed betrayals. But from that destruction had emerged something cleaner and more honest than what had existed before. "Your Grace," Sarah said, turning from the memorial with tears in her eyes, but peace on her face, "I wanted to thank you again for what you've done. Jonathan would be so proud to know that his sacrifice finally brought the truth to light." "He earned his rest," Corwin replied, watching as other family members of the lost soldiers came forward to add their own flowers to the memorial. Over the past 2 years, these people had become more than just victims of an old conspiracy. They had become the foundation of a new kind of community built on truth rather than comfortable lies. Margaret emerged from the rebuilt main house, her arms full of correspondence that spoke to the changes that had swept through the kingdom in the wake of the Thornwick revelations. Military reforms had been instituted, oversight committees had been established, and most importantly, families who had lost loved ones in various campaigns were finally receiving honest answers about what had happened to their sons and husbands. The Crown's final report arrived this morning. "Your Grace," she said, offering him an official document that bore the royal seal. "They've officially commended your courage in exposing the conspiracy and have granted pardons to all family members who were unknowingly involved in the cover-up." The pardon was largely symbolic. Corwin had never been charged with any crime, but it represented the kingdom's acknowledgement that choosing truth over expediency sometimes required breaking laws that had been written to protect comfortable lies rather than inconvenient truths. Thomas approached from the direction of the stables, leading a mare that had recently foaled. Beside the mother walked a young colt whose movements showed the intelligence and nobility that marked the best of the royal guard hound's bloodline. Valor, now grey around the muzzle but still alert, had indeed sired a new generation during his peaceful retirement at the rebuilt Aelbridge. "The breeding program is exceeding expectations, Your Grace," Thomas reported with satisfaction that came from seeing good work produce meaningful results. "These new hounds will serve with honesty and honor, trained to protect truth rather than conceal it." The irony was not lost on Corwin that his father's greatest shame had become the foundation for his own greatest achievement. The Royal Guard Hound breeding program, re-established at Aelbridge under Crown supervision, was producing animals trained not just for military service, but for the specific mission of ensuring that information reached appropriate authorities rather than being buried in convenient graves. Father Osric appeared in the courtyard, his arms carrying books rather than weapons, a collection of historical texts that now told the true story of Thornwick alongside dozens of other military operations that had been subjected to honest examination in the wake of the conspiracy's exposure. The priest had become something of a celebrity among scholars who specialized in military history, though he wore his newfound fame with the humility of someone who understood that his real achievement lay in finally keeping faith with the men he had failed to protect 20 years before. "The university press wants to publish another edition," he told Corwin. "They're saying the Thornwick papers have become required reading in military academies throughout the kingdom." "Good," Corwin replied. "Let them study what happens when leaders choose reputation over responsibility. Perhaps future commanders will remember the cost of such choices." As afternoon settled over the estate, Corwin found himself walking the grounds with Valor, both of them older and scarred by their experiences, but somehow more complete than they had been before the truth emerged. The dog's mission was finished, but his purpose had evolved, from carrying evidence of old betrayals to standing as a symbol of loyalty that endures beyond the failures of those who command it. They paused at the site where the original estate cemetery had been expanded to properly honor the 47 men who had died at Thornwick. Each grave now bore a headstone with the soldier's name, his age and death, and a simple inscription that spoke to the truth they had died protecting. They kept faith with their brothers. "We did it," Corwin said quietly, kneeling to place his hand on Valor's graying head. "It took 20 years. It cost more than anyone should have to pay, but we did it. They're remembered now, properly remembered, and their families know they mattered." Valor looked up at him with eyes that still held intelligence and depth, but also something that had been absent for 2 decades, peace. The dog's long vigil was over, his burden shared and finally resolved through the courage of people who chose difficult truth over easy lies. As the sun set over the rebuilt estate, painting the memorial stone in shades of gold that seemed to honor the men whose names it bore, Corwin reflected on the strange turns that life could take. A single pound spent on compassion at a forgotten auction had changed the course of his life, exposed a conspiracy that had poisoned his kingdom for 20 years, and ultimately taught him that true nobility came not from the honors inherited, but from the choices made in moments when no one else was watching. Valor pressed against his legs with the contentment of a creature whose faith had been justified, and whose loyalty had finally found a master worthy of the trust that had been so brutally betrayed decades before. Together, they walked back toward the rebuilt house where honest light streamed through windows that no longer hid shameful secrets, their footsteps echoing with the quiet satisfaction of duty fulfilled and promises kept.